Well, good evening, everyone, and isn't it nice to have a round of applause before you've even done anything? But, there we are. This is the third in the trilogy. We've looked at Eastbourne in the 20s and 30s, and we've looked at how Eastbourne fared during the Second World War, and we saw it sort of really quite substantially damaged and ravaged in various ways. And it really picks up now at the point where the war ends, and really just describing the sort of challenge that Eastbourne had to sort of recover physically, I suppose, and then the challenge it had at the same time of coping with a modern world, a post-war world, where the demands of the tourism industry and other demands really had their effect. So post-war recovery and the modernisation of Eastbourne really going up to 1975. If we go any further, it stops being history and starts being, something else, I suppose. Lovely street parties to celebrate the end of things, and quite rightly so, because everybody had been through the mill for a number of years, but a lot of challenges ahead. And Eastbourne was really in a pickle. Key buildings were lost, the central library and the fire station gone. Eastbourne always had a housing problem, and made even worse by 500 homes gone completely and 1,000 more homes really quite badly damaged, needing a lot of attention. Bomb sites, there were 56 substantial bomb sites in Eastbourne. That isn't just sort of, the end of a terrace that's been damaged. These are substantial sites. Parks and gardens in a very sorry state, because they've been used for growing vegetables, of course. Even the lovely carpet gardens up by the pier had been used for growing onions. The downs covered in munitions, left substantially by the Canadians. And all credit to them, because they were all volunteers here in the Second World War, but the Canadians, or the Canucks as they called themselves, did a lot of target practice, etc., across the downs, and it really was quite a dangerous place. Beaches full of barbed wire still, of course, and a lot of tank traps, and groins and sea walls needing urgent repair. And you think, well, so what? Nothing had happened for 6 years on the groins, and there was substantial erosion of the shingle, and the very foundations of some of the bits of sea wall were actually under threat. So really quite serious. And this was the #1 priority, to get things sorted out and make up for 6 years of neglect. And the council spent £75,000, which is about 2.7 million today, in a time when money was very scarce indeed, just getting that sorted out. And of course they had areas like this, Hellfire Corner at Bourne Street, to come to terms with, and this is Astaire Avenue. So, really quite a challenge. And this is the upper part of Terminus Road. Again, bomb damage, one of 10 sites on Terminus Road alone, where a lot of work was required. And this is outside what we know as the T.J. Hughes building on the right, itself damaged by fire during the war, and you can see the vacant plot on the other side. And as I say, there were 10 of these just in one road alone. And things that were lost, the lovely Barclays Bank, and something was done to sort of carry the service on, of course, pro tem, and the loss of the lovely Institute at the bottom of Grove Road. So, a lot of suffering, really. And this isn't an ideal place to come and sunbathe. And a lot of work, again, had to be done really quite quickly to make the beaches safe and available again. And if you wanted to walk on the pier, you had to be good at long jumping, as you can see. That was done during the war to stop it being used by any German landing. So the planning for the post-war situation actually started in 1943, and it was sort of wish list. I think they knew that victory was at hand, and to its credit, the council started consulting on what the wish list for the future was going to be. They thought it'd be nice to have a Wish Tower cafe and refreshment kiosks on the seafront. This is quite a revolution. A new bathing pool at the Redoubt, to redevelop the Winter Garden. In fact, all funding of the Winter Garden had stopped quite deliberately in 1937 because they wanted to tear it down and redevelop it as a rendezvous centre. Improvements at Holywell, rebuilding Hellfire Corner, an aerodrome for Eastbourne on the Crumbles mainly was being advocated, and extending the lovely boulevard outside here of Devonshire Place down to the station, and sort of cutting right through and having a big square in front of the station. And that scheme, that idea went on until about 1954-55, and they thought they'd had a discussion about the future of meads, because there was a point of view that meads that had really sort of been created, you know, in Victorian and Edwardian times, had sort of outlived its usefulness, because it was sort of full of very, very large houses, 8, 10, 12 bedrooms, some of them, and that wasn't sort of appropriate for the new modern age. And they thought, would there be a possibility of really sort of demolishing the whole of Meads and building modern housing in its place? The idea didn't get much traction, as you know. And the recovery principle was Eastbourne must retain its reputation as a health and pleasure resort without superior and without altering its general character. Improvements are essential for the town to continue to prosper for both residents and visitors. And you're standing in Terminus Road and you're looking up towards the station. On the other side of the road is where McDonald's now is. And quite a change happened very quickly. 1951, Sainsbury's supermarket opened, the first purpose-built supermarket in the country. And this was a revolution in retailing, of course, and a lot of very bemused shoppers wondering what they ought to do with their baskets. But this is where Marks and Spencer's was until 1943. Just a site needing redevelopment and looking at plans for the future. And of course that was in place in 1954 and still substantially the same store. Plumber Roddis, really opposite where McDonald's is now, spent a lot of money refurbishing their store in the 1950s. And Barker's came to Eastbourne, the T.J. Hughes building, as I say, affected by fire quite considerably during the war and substantially rebuilt post-war, and in 1953 taken over by Barker's of Kensington. Which of course they called Barker's of Eastbourne. And this really was sort of a feather in the cap of Eastbourne, of having a place like Barker's of Kensington coming here. And this was Beale's department store on the corner where the Premier Inn is now. And that was there until 1939. Beale's left to consolidate in Bournemouth and never came back again. And this was taken over by the Co-op in 1949. And you can sort of see how popular the opening day was. And Bobbies & Co., the forerunner of Debenhams, really invested a great deal of money refurbishing the store. It had been destroyed, not destroyed, but affected by several attacks. And this is where a lovely arcade was until it was bombed out, and they, as I say, spent a lot of money refurbishing. The Grand Hotel opened in 1946, was closed to the public during the war and used primarily by the RAF. So it's nice to get things back on track. No car parking at the front of the hotel. Everybody had to park on the street. The gardens were converted later. And this is 1948. These are the carpet gardens, where not an onion in sight by now. It's just sort of nice to see sort of, people sort of coming back and enjoying the seaside again. And I love this as well. It's just nice characterful sort of picture. Ration books. In fact, the lady who lent me her ration book is still alive and doing very well at the age of 92, still thriving in Eastbourne. And this is 1948-49. Of course, some folk may remember rationing continuing. And this is a clothing book from 46-47. Tremendous, these documents. This is Hyde Gardens. Beautiful Hyde Gardens, private gardens for the use of the two terraces either side, Hyde Gardens. And all uprooted in 1953 to make way for car parks, because with a substantial growth in car ownership, the town had to do something to cope with the car. And this was one of the first victims, as it were. Again, coping with the car, this is Caffin's, I think an incredibly modern, progressive sort of building for its time. And this was located on Upperton Road at the bottom of the avenue. Again, buildings like this sort of help to sort of, I think, bolster the confidence of the town, really. And housing, the prefabs. First prefabs were built in Hampden Park. All the foundations and the sewer work was actually undertaken by German prisoners of war before they were repatriated in May 46. So that at the beginning of 46, the first of the bungalows were built, and they were constructed in a day. And they had an integral fridge, which was really quite a revolution at the time, a fridge built into the bungalow, and the rent was 12 and sixpence a week. And more followed. This is in the Old Town Cherry Gardens area, but part of a plan to sort of deal with the Eastbourne's substantial housing problem and the losses after the war. And this was another priority was the redevelopment of Hellfire Corner, the Bourne Street area, into the flats that we know today. And at Hampden Park, the development of the Chatfield estate, so called, because that was the name of the farmer that sold them the land, and the first tranche of 150 houses built on the west side of the railway line. And the government regulation was you had to spend no more than £1,100 per house. So there we are. And here's the Lord Mayor of London. And he's at Langley to open up the new Langley Village. Langley Village was on the cards in the late 30s, and the land was compulsorily acquired, but nothing, of course, took place because of the war. And again, this was a real priority for the early 50s. And this was the sort of development that was there. What a pity that no trees were planted, but there we go. And in the private sector, a lot of building really between Hampden Park and Eastbourne. This is the Rodmill estate and the Selwyn Road area that was developed in the early 1950s. Part of this land was actually owned by the Grand Hotel at one time that used it as market gardens. Schools. Now, the private schools had always been a major industry in Eastbourne, and there were scores and scores of them at any one time, some small, some large. And even by the late 1930s, there were still 30 private schools, and only one or two of them survived the war and in fact sort of stayed open. And there were really just sort of 8 of them by the time you get to round about 1950. But really that loss was taken over quite a bit by the growth of foreign language schools. And I remember as a teenager growing up in Eastbourne being incredibly jealous of the Persian boys, and they were from Persia at the time, who were very, very rich, and they all seemed to have really whizzy red sports cars. I mean, it was really quite something. And the other major cohort was Swedish girls. And the local lads took it upon themselves to sort of, help educate them in sort of English ways. And and in return were educated in Swedish ways, but that's another story. And the Eastbourne High School for Girls and the Hampden Park Secondary School had been open for a very short time in 1939 and then closed when the war arrived. And they were able to open fully in the 40s. Ratton School, a major development, opened in 56, and Bishop Bell School at Langley, part of Langley Village, opened in 58. And an incredible demand, of course, for primary school places, because this was the time, you know, when the bulge was taking place. And Ockling School, when it was first operating, I think had 1,000 pupils, and it was the largest primary school in the southeast of England. So, you know, really quite something. And Highfield Junior School at Hampden Park is my sort of alma mater. And this is it. This was opened round about 1950 and intended as a 2-form entry. And by the time I got there in about 53, 54, it was a 5-form entry with 44 in the class. I mean, we were sitting on each other's heads, really. But it just sort of shows the challenge of actually dealing with a massive change, and particularly that post-war population boom. So the challenges for the County Borough Council, so this is an all-purpose council at the time until 1974. Massive shortages of capital and materials. The ministry was really keeping a very tight rein on capital spending, and materials were in short supply. I mean, timber was actually rationed until 1956. We don't realise, do we? And the amount that was being spent was controlled by building licenses. So if he wanted to build something new or substantially renovate something, you had to have a building license. And each authority was actually given a certain number of building licenses that had to be used during that 12-month period. And you used it or you lost it. And that was it. So if you didn't get it done by the end of March, you actually lost the license, and that was it. So very, very strict conditions. Lot of population, of course, returning after the war, which sort of helped with the baby boom as well. And the baby boom is really such a strain, as we've already said, on schools, but all on the health service as well. Think of all the demands that there are. And the health service at this time, pre-48, was actually run by the local authority, who managed the hospitals and the ambulance service and the net nurse and everything else. And you think, well, phew, 1948, you know, the NHS comes into being, and all of that pressure suddenly is lifted off. Well, no, not really, because the actual process of a measured handover to the NHS took about 5 or 6 years. So again, a lot of pressure on local services while that was taking place. And I'll talk a little bit about adjusting to modern times later with traffic growth and the need for jobs. Some repairs and renewals, of course, took place, and where that lovely institute was replaced by the new library. I have to say, as a local, I still think of it as the new library, but it's over 60 years old now. And a lovely picture of the inside of it. I think that's tremendous. So getting match fit for the new age of tourism. In 1938, just before war broke out, for the first time people had a statutory holiday entitlement of 1 week's paid holiday, which of course they couldn't really take, but post-war they certainly did. In 1960, the council here conducted a national perception survey, and they asked people, mainly who had never visited Eastbourne, what they thought of it. And this was a national survey. And it was sort of quite telling. The results came back were sort of a bit sort of posh, but a bit sort of boring at the same time. And they gave everybody apparently a little outline of the British Isles and said, put an X where Eastbourne is. And the majority thought it was in the Thames estuary. So there you go. And that apparently the results of that survey did have quite an impact. As it says at the bottom, an emphasis on sun and fun. Because they thought, well, this is what the new breed of tourists actually wants, and Eastbourne can't really make a living carrying on as it did in the 20s and 30s, being the height of respectability and really not very much to do. So that focus on children and families, growth in car ownership. By the time you get to 1960, 1/3 of all households owned a car. So that was going to be sort of quite a dramatic change. And they thought they'd start to specialise in the conference industry. And they targeted, I suppose, sort of second degree conferences, things like Rotary and YMCA national conferences and that sort of thing. And I think on one or two occasions there was a Liberal conference here, before Liberal Democrats. I think it's a Liberal conference. And certainly a decision to have more entertainment and a better choice of entertainment. And actually the council took quite a responsibility in terms of making sure that this happened. Now this is a nice sort of town guide from the 1960s. And I think a lot of these guides are what I call shy with a shingle, because don't these shingle beaches look particularly sandy to you? Because sand sells a lot better than shingle. If you're interesting, isn't it? And of course the railway companies get in on this, Sun Trap of the South, etc. And I know we haven't got it today, we've got a different sort of slogan today, haven't we, breathed it in. But I think that Sun Trap of the South is just absolutely unbeatable. There we are. This picture really is from sort of around about 1980, but from the 60s and through the 70s, the rail companies were doing a lot of holiday expresses to Eastbourne, not only from Birmingham and Leicester Derby, the Midlands, but also from further north, from Liverpool and Manchester, and at times having trains coming from Scotland to Eastbourne. From Glasgow to Eastbourne, and it really did make a difference to the local tourist industry. And this is a picture, this is round about 64 or 65, and you just sort of, way before we had air shows and things, just shows how popular the town was. So very, very successful. And there's another picture there. All sorts of improvements going on. This is a lovely modern sort of style entrance to the pier from the early 1950s. We've now gone back to sort of Edwardian style, haven't we, at the moment? And here we are, the lovely kiosks started to appear on the seafront. Perhaps 50 years earlier, people would have gone absolutely bananas at the prospect of eating food or sipping tea on Eastbourne seafront. So times are actually changing. And as a bit of nostalgia, I thought I'd give you the menu from round about 1960. You could still get a Whopper for four old pence. I think it was tremendous there. And of course the lovely carpet gardens in full bloom, and featuring a couple of fountains. Which did very well until fairy liquid was invented, and they had to take them away. So curtain up in terms of entertainment. The pier is re-slabbed and opened in 1946. No need for long jumping anymore. The pier music pavilion becomes a dance hall in 1947. The Redoubt Music Gardens reopened. Sandy Powell and other sort of quite celebrated people were at the Pier Theatre on a regular basis. And the council buys the Devonshire Park Theatre in 1953 and buys the Hippodrome in 1961. So a lot of these things moving into the council purview. And the council deliberately set up an entertainments committee to make sure that the quality of entertainment offered by the town came up to a certain standard, and actually had a Mr. Eastbourne appointed, who was sort of the tourism officer. And I remember hearing constantly the name of a chap called Peter Bedford, who was the tourist officer. So this is the dance hall on the pier, replacing the musical theatre. These are the gardens at the Redoubt, and this is Uncle Bertie's children's show, incredibly popular. Things for kids and families, this was quite important. And the Pier Theatre continued until 1970, when there's a major fire. And this seated 1,100 people, so really quite something. And the Devonshire Park Theatre, as I say, taken over by the council in 1953, always had a rep company available during the season, so that people could see a different performance each week. Again, very important. And this is the Hippodrome. And the Hippodrome really only just sort of made it through as a theatre, because round about 1952, when the independent television companies were being formed, there were substantial negotiations going on to take over, for Southern Television to take over the Hippodrome Theatre as the main studios. But it fell through, but they nearly got there. Now this is King's Holiday Park and Country Club. Accommodation needs were changing. At the end of the war, something like 35% of people who came to Eastbourne stayed in bed and breakfast accommodation. Something like 20 years later, that had gone down to about 8%. So substantial changes, and they like the idea of caravan parks and staying in their own sort of little lodges and things. And certainly King's Holiday Park and Country Club on the east side of town, fairly near to where Asda is now, certainly came up trumps. And this is the country club itself, looking like, well, what, a big factory, I suppose. But this was really, in its time, famous throughout the southeast. This was a major destination. And you just look at some of the people that they featured: Baron Knights, Joe Brown, Jerry and the Pacemakers. These were top stars at the time, appearing sort of, almost on a nightly basis. This was a big draw for Eastbourne. And here we've got sort of a future king with his backing group, the 3 Degrees, making shapes. So there we are. Buses, this is interesting. Post-war, they launched these lovely open-top white buses, and there were 6 of them, all with a different name. And of course, the clever challenge was, for kids, you have to take a ride on every one of them while you're here on holiday. A bit hard on people's pockets, of course. And the William Alcorn, one of 2 pleasure boats that operated, and did really very well. I mean, these boats would take up to 3,500 passengers a week going around Beachy Head, etc. So incredibly popular. This is 1973, and you've got Live and Let Die at what was called the Picturedrome at the time, one of 6 cinemas in Eastbourne in the early 1970s. And I think some of the cinemas were so popular because there seemed to be a special arrangement whereby a couple of Eastbourne cinemas got the films in the same week as they were actually launched in the West End. So it was quite something, and you can see the enormous queues to see the latest James Bond film. This is Devonshire Park and the part of the tennis area. This is the children's playground. And tennis at Devonshire Park had sort of, lumbered along. But it wasn't until round about the mid-50s that they actually sort of started to promote, stars in tennis. And here's the lovely Fred Perry, who was actually commissioned to come and play here. And then 20 years later, you have this advert, which is really promoting Eastbourne as a major tennis centre. £65,000 in prize money. This is quite something. And this is getting Billie Jean King and people like this, Virginia Wade, to actually come and play here. And I think that was sort of the start of really putting Eastbourne on the map as far as tennis is concerned. And why not? I mean, after all, it is the second oldest tennis club in the country. This is Devonshire Place, and there had always been in the 20s and 30s all sorts of concours d'élégance, as they were called, car shows going on, and that certainly remains so in the 50s and 60s. And then I came across this. This is inside the Winter Garden, and certain folk who know about these things might confirm that that's an MGC at the time. But they actually had cars driving round inside the Winter Garden as part of a black tie evening. It's quite something. And the ambition to get the Wish Tower cafeteria built was realised, of course, with its lovely sun lounge as well. And in 1957, the Eastbourne Carnival was resurrected. And this really was quite something. I can remember as a child, there were always at least 5 brass bands in the procession. Really quite something. You know, sort of like, you know, the Royal Marines and things like this. It was a really prestigious event. And on bands, this was always a feature, the Monday March. This was super. When there's always a military band each week playing at the Grand Parade Grandstand, and they would arrive by train, assemble at the station, and then march playing up Terminus Road and along the seafront to announce their arrival in the town. Absolutely tremendous. I love that. I'll just sort of touch on the council and the role of the council for a bit. This is the County Borough Council, and as I said before, all purpose, ran education, highways, sewage, etc. Public assistance became social services. It was a housing authority, police, libraries, bus company, etc. Today, the Borough Council does the last one, planning. The rest is done by other people. And it was this chap, Francis Busby, who became the town clerk in 1939 and served right through until 1974. And this chap, I think, sort of was really very useful in helping an ambitious council to actually realise their ambitions. And he fought very hard for projects like this, of course, the Congress Theatre opening in 1963, and controversial at the time for its architecture in the eyes of some, but you know, a massive auditorium at the time, 1,750 seats, and it still is the largest auditorium on the south coast. So again, something of a feather in the cap. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the inside of that. I just want to talk about the Winter Garden Saga. I had mentioned that in 1937 all maintenance was stopped because they were going to redevelop in 5 years, and of course the war got in the way. In 51 they wanted to clear the whole site and build a 2,000-seat conference centre and a ballroom as well for 1,500 people, and banqueting area for 600 people. So incredible ambition, and that was knocked on the head by the government, who said no way can you borrow this amount of capital. By the time we get to 1955, Peter Stonham, the really quite celebrated local architect, came up with an idea for having a rendezvous centre at the Wish Tower. That had some traction for a time, but was eventually abandoned because the site just really wasn't big enough. And they came back to the Winter Garden in 1959 and said, well, let's have a toned down version of what we were trying to do in 51. And of course in 63 the Congress opens. And in 68 they said, well, let's have a large breakout hall. There's no point having conferences, we want exhibitions as well, people need to sell things. And again, that was really knocked on the head by the prospect of local government reorganisation coming up. Of course, we had to wait right through to 2019 for the Welcome Building and that accommodation to open. And then here we are, 23-24, the refurbishment of the Winter Garden is nearing completion, and that's sort of like, what, something like 86 years after the idea was first mooted. But again, a very good entertainment centre. I mean, people, you know, now we can look at this and say, oh, Dickie Henderson, Edmund Hockridge. But these were people who were on television every Saturday night. You know, these were top people coming and performing in Eastbourne. And this is Margot Fonteyn in, 1976. And look, you could actually go and see Margot Fonteyn dancing for as little as £1.50. Tremendous. And you know about the town and the Welcome Building. So we're talking about plans just for a moment. New planning legislation, 1947, Town and Country Planning Act. Every area has to produce a plan for the future. And this is a plan for 52 that proposed large areas of new housing in Old Town, in Langley, which we've heard about, and Hampden Park to a degree. Major spend on sewers, really boring. You can't see any of it, but if you don't build the sewers, you just don't grow, you just don't develop. And this is a revolution. Light industry proposed at Hampden Park, Waterworks Road, really sort of down by the railway line where ESK is, Wharf Road near to the station, and Lockbridge Drove. This is Eastbourne advertising, saying, I think sort of with a deep breath, saying, yes, we favour local light industry coming to Eastbourne to sort of diversify the jobs market. And they set out the Brampton Road trading estate near to Hampden Park Station and started trying to attract people there. And one of the first people to bite was Armour's Pharmaceuticals. Which was really sort of quite a progressive company. But to get them here, the council actually had to build a factory for them. It was actually an award-winning factory. It won a National Architectural Award. But they really had to go to quite substantial lengths just to kick off the idea of light industry in Eastbourne. And this is looking at the Birch Road industrial area opposite big Tesco's on Lockbridge Drove, and this was started off in the late 60s. And the same shot looking across the road, and that very large building at the top was Birdseye. And Birdseye coming to town is the first major employer, employed just over 1,000 people, which was really quite important for Eastbourne, and a lot of women, so a lot of second wage packets coming into the household, very important. And here we are, this is on the production line for Arctic Roll. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that they produce 1 mile of Arctic Roll every day. So it's tremendous. And this was a major employer, the Dental Estimates Board in Borough Lane, and really doing a lot of the administration for the entire NHS dental service. Major employer, hundreds and hundreds of jobs. Of course, not a computer in sight. And really at the back of the avenue, we're looking at the late 60s, early 70s now, quite a few sort of substantial office blocks being developed for the first time. And a hopeful sign, really, of London publishers and health administration and things like this, and insurance companies sort of moving into a place like Eastbourne. And there were great prospects of it sort of becoming as successful as places like Bournemouth had been in attracting offices. And it worked for a while, but this sort of, by this time, 1 hour 30 from London was, and you know, in the absence of computers and all the rest of it, just made Eastbourne that little bit too remote. And although the offices are still substantially occupied, it hasn't got the sort of prestige occupiers that it previously had. We moved to the second plan, the mid-1960s plan, and I call it the pie in the sky plan because that's what people said at the time. I remember being around and going to the consultations on this, and they were proposing a new hospital and lovely brand new roads and a harbour village at the Crumbles. What? And a town park on the marshes, and an indoor shopping mall in the town centre, and the pedestrianisation of Terminus Road. Where are the buses going to go, they said. So, you know, this really was pie in the sky, and they said, this will never happen. And you don't need to memorise this, but really this was the grand plan for from the 1960s, and if you sort of take the western half of that, the left-hand half, that's sort of like established Eastbourne, and if you take the right-hand half, the eastern half, that's really where all the development was going to be. And this is the thing, the whole focus was looking to the east for the first time. Victorian and Edwardian Eastbourne had been developed really in the west of the town. That's where all the emphasis and the investment had been. This was a major switch to the east. And here we are, it's around about 74, 75, the DGH being built. I wish the sheet would take more interest, but still, there we are. And the first carriageway, single carriageway of Lockbridge Drove was built. And we get that cafe and sun lounge at the Redoubt, now being substantially, of course, renovated, thank goodness. And within the Redoubt Fortress, a lovely model village and aquarium was installed. So a lot of fun, a lot of activity, things to do on the eastern margins of the town. And a butterfly centre opened. We could go round and look at butterflies. And Treasure Island as well. So a whole string of activities for children and families was being developed really quite quickly. And the trams ran from Prince's Park, and they started in 1959. These are sort of like almost toy trams really, they weren't anything serious, but they trundled out into the middle of the Crumbles where there was nothing happening at all, and you stayed on the tram and came back again. But that photograph, for those who've not lived in Eastbourne for too long, just sort of shows how substantial and how remote the Crumbles were. Eastbourne Leisure Pool, so this was the one originally intended for the Redoubt, but moved further down to Prince's Park. And I'm sure you're well aware of that, and now, of course, under some threat. And a little later on, of course, Fort Fun opened. But part of this whole idea of having a beads on the string, as it were, of things for children and families. Oh, this is an exciting time. May 73, Tony Blackburn landing in his helicopter. Ta-da! In the car park. And this was to open the Langley Shopping Centre, which was the first cupboard centre, the first indoor centre in the town, 1973. And there it is, and it's still there, of course. Now, the Crumbles. That plan proposed a marina, a harbour marina development in this area, and people really didn't think it was going to happen, and it almost didn't. I mean, it took sort of like best part of 25 years of wrangling, putting trying to get an Act of Parliament approved, and it wasn't. It was voted down, and they went back for a second time. And it's a long, hard struggle. And it's not until you get really to 1990 that the first fruits began to emerge. You can see on the left-hand side those big white buildings. That's Asda, just about to open, and the cinema complex and all of that sort of thing. But still, no real development of the harbour itself. You still got the shallow pools that were there from the extraction of shingle over about a 50 or 60 year period. And major investment in the sea locks. And you can see the size of those locks against the small figures below them. Until we have what we have today. And I think Eastbourne's sort of quite lucky to have this. because there's something like 80 acres or 50 football pitches worth of marina, of berthing area there. And I'm told, I don't know one way or the other, that it's the largest protected marina in Northern Europe. It really is quite something. And look at these two maps. This is the crumbles in 1945 at the end of the war, and look what it's like today. Absolutely transformed. And more generally, this is looking at the east end of the town, that sort of eastern half, and again you can see what it was like in 1945 and all the development that has taken place today. And I'm just going to finish just a little bit talking about the town centre. This was sort of like the late 60s when buses ran up and down and stopped outside the shop that you wanted to go to, and people walked along the pavement and cars drove up and down and could park on one side of the street as well for nothing. So they pedestrianised it. And I love these pictures when Woolies was still open, but just looking at the detail of the picture, how well dressed everybody was at the time. Not an anorak in sight. And of course, publicity for the new Eastbourne Arndale Centre, a very large covered area, and work underway, pictures being taken from somewhere near Barclays Bank. And we end up with that opening in 1980. So it's now sort of almost 45 years old. It's amazing how time goes on. And really, last picture or so, this is Eastbourne in sort of like mid to late, mid-70s really, the end of the 30-year period that we're talking about. And it had achieved, I think, a great deal. It had modernised itself and really was sort of quite successful. And certainly it went on in 1990 to win the prestigious National English Tourist Board Award for the best resort in the country. So, you know, not too bad at all. So looking back from basket case to showcase, the prominent role of the council, I have to say, coping with massive population growth and change, actually taking over a lot of the entertainment and making sure it was of a particular standard, and certainly encouraging new types of jobs, diversing the local economy away a little from just being totally dependent on tourism, and, as it says, thinking big. And I think the main thing is really that new focus on the east end of the town, because it's the east end, what was originally the Cinderella bit of Eastbourne, that really came to the fore and received all the investment. And probably a lot of Eastbourne's future resides in the eastern part of the town. So that's it. Thank you.